Hello and welcome back to the Franchise Growth Pod. My name is Belle, Director of Marketing at AC Inc. And I am here with, for the very first time on FGP, Robert Bruski, everybody.
Yo, what's shaking, Belle?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you on here, Robert. I cannot believe this is the first time we're having a chat on the Franchise Growth Pod.
I know it's pretty. I'm excited. I've been sitting there waiting. I'm like, is she gonna ask me? It's like a high school dance. Should I go ask her? Is she gonna ask me? What do I do? Maybe I'll just sit here. I'll go hang out by the punch bowl.
That's hilarious. Well, for anyone who doesn't know who's listening, actually, Robert does a weekly podcast with Angela and Rob Rants. And if you haven't listened to that one, you guys have been doing that one for years. And it's every single week. They come out on Wednesday. They're a podcast and a YouTube series. So Robert is a very, a very solid podcaster already, and has. So if you haven't checked it out, and Rob Rants across all the streaming platforms. But I had to just get him on the Franchise Growth Pod for all of you. We have a very exciting episode for today.
I'm excited. This is my subject. Like, I'm a major nerd on this subject. So, let's get rocking and rolling.
I want to just say, even though Robert's an expert on this subject, it's not socks. For anyone who is thinking it's not sock marketing. For anyone who is like, ooh, what is Robert really good at? Sock marketing. Unfortunately, that'll be a separate episode. We'll have to do a separate podcast all about that. Actually, I did want to ask you, how did you feel about being such a sock marketing influencer in the franchise space a couple months ago?
A sock star, you mean?
A sock star, yeah, of all the success you've been having.
It feels really good. I'd like to thank the Academy and all the people that supported me along the way. But honestly, you know what? I was sitting on a round table and everyone was talking about influencer marketing. And when you think influencer marketing, you're thinking like, how do I get Ryan Reynolds or Tom Cruise, like big people, right? And I'm like, let's go micro influencers, people who might have 1,000 or 5,000 followers. And then I started looking at the market, and my endeavor to procure more franchisees, franchise owners for Control V, I looked at the influencers that could impact that and just let her rip.
That's amazing. Okay, so to provide, I just realized that I just assume every single person in franchising and business knows who Robert Bruski is. I do have to say, Robert Bruski is the franchisor at Control V, a virtual reality arcade, originally based in Canada, but spreading out to the US as well. And such a fun concept, like such an incredibly cool concept. Very much entertainment, families, but there's corporate events you guys do there. It's a really cool concept. And he's also chief hype officer over here at AC Inc. So him and I work on some projects together, including things like influencer marketing things and events and all of that. So I just assume everyone knows who you are, but I thought I would give you the intro you deserve.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Belle.
He's the multifaceted. He's very much. You also have like all these other businesses you tackle. You're a musician. I feel like you always have something new you're telling me about. You're like into martial arts. I just feel like you have a million hobbies and activities and businesses, and it's hard to keep up. But that is the basic 411.
I've got to keep myself entertained.
It's true. No, there's never a dull moment in Robert Bruski's world. That's for sure. So I guess we should say, if it's not about sock marketing, which if again anyone missed it, Robert was such a big sock influencer must have been a couple months ago now, but you sent out all these Control V socks and had everyone on LinkedIn posting about them. It was absolutely incredible. And socks have been around for a long time. Like we have, Go Be Awesome socks, and FBR has these really fun franchise rockstar socks. Like socks have been around for such a long time, but all of a sudden, as soon as Robert sent them out and was like, everyone posts on LinkedIn, and it just blew up. And now everyone is all about the sock influencer marketing, which I think is such a fun idea. So I just, again,
I've been into socks for a long time. In fact, right now I'm wearing Jimi Hendrix socks. I'm part of a sock subscription club, and I get new socks every month. I've been doing this for like probably about 10 years.
That's insane. Okay, this is a question everyone's asking. We need to get the answer. What is your favorite pair of socks? That maybe from your subscription. What have you gotten from your subscription that's your favorite?
It might actually be the Jimi Hendrix socks that I'm wearing right now. Like I blow through socks a lot. Like I wear socks all the time. I love my feet covered. So there's like a regular sort of churn here, and my favorite may no longer be my favorite in a couple months.
Got it. So it's ever changing, but the Hendrix socks are winning at the moment. I love that.
Right.
Perfect. Well, I am actually wearing my Control V socks right now, which is
What?
so funny. Yeah, I little. Ooh, that's so
There we go. There we go.
that was harder than so for anyone who's listening and not watching on YouTube, I did just hold my foot up and kind of had to like lean over my chair. That was a lot harder than I was thinking it was going to be. But I am wearing them right now. I was like, my feet were so cold earlier, so I popped them on. Anyways, we're not actually talking about socks today, folks. We are talking about shareholder value. Total 180, not about socks or influencer marketing at all. We're actually talking about shareholder value and how it benefits your franchisees to be talking about it, educating them on it, and having them improve their own. So I want to start off the conversation though, Robert, with an explanation of what shareholder value actually is.
Okay, well, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about shareholder value specifically. I mean, I used to do this a lot in my past life. You know, I was in buy-side investment management, working at hedge funds and trying to value companies, et cetera. But also, as a CEO of the company, there's 3 jobs that you have to do. 1 is maintain your culture. 2, think about the future of your company. And 3, increase shareholder value and shareholder wealth across the system. And sometimes you think about, okay, how do I make my franchise like as a home office more valuable, right? But because your business is franchising, your home office derives its value from its individual franchisees. So
Okay.
you have to be focusing on increasing their value, because if you ever wanted to exit your system, the buyer is going to do their due diligence. They're not just going to see how much cash you have in your bank account. They're going to see the sources of that cash, how stable it is, how recurring it is, right? So when it comes to shareholder value, there's a lot of things that go into it. You know, some people will think it's the cash that's sitting in your account, or maybe it's your recurring revenue, or maybe it's your profit margin, or maybe they factor in things that are a little bit more subjective, you know, like the value of your customer base, or any goodwill or intellectual property, like your brand, or agreements that you have with specific government organizations. So these all kind of factor into shareholder value. But ultimately, you have to distill this down to a number somehow, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what people are going to pay for. And you know, when I do valuations and analysis on companies, for the most part, about 80 to 90% of my analysis is on the softer things: their management, their governance, their business model, it's only about 10 to 20% that's the actual numbers. But those numbers are important because that's ultimately what somebody's going to pay for the company. So it's important to increase those numbers. And there's multiple ways to do that, which I'm sure we're going to get into here. So
Yeah.
does that answer your question? Maybe?
Totally does. It totally does. And you and I had a brief chat, obviously, before we hopped on here. But I think that really clarifies too when we're talking about it, it's not based on like one number. And I think that can be definitely something that people can head into conversations like this or thinking about that value piece and think, well, it's based on this specific number or it's based on this bit, but it's actually a valuation of so much of the business. And you said something actually before we hopped on to actually podcast, which I thought was really valuable, which is to look at the revenue coming in is awesome. Like that's a great number. But if there's a ton of debt or, the higher the expenses go, the actually, the smaller that margin becomes and those kinds of things, I think it's just, it involves so much more than just like one specific revenue number, which I think is what maybe lots of people think of when they think of that. But it's really this whole view of the business and how successful and profitable that business can be. And actually, you've already kind of segued into that next piece, which is how does this even apply to franchises specifically and also specifically to franchisees? So maybe just
Okay.
go into a little bit more about as a franchisee, like why does shareholder value kind of matter to me? Or why would I care about those kinds of things as a franchise owner specifically?
Sure. Well, I think that, to start with your second question there, it's really valuable to everyone, but to a
Yes.
franchisee specifically, because at some point you have a succession plan. You're going to do something with your business, whether you're going to sell it or, let it lapse or, whatever, gift it to somebody, et cetera. It has to have a value, and people are always going to ask, what's the value, how much it's worth? Even if you're gifting it to somebody, they're still going to want to know the value because they need to declare it on their tax returns.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got to figure out a way to find this value. Now, there's so many different ways to value a company, and it changes from industry to industry. for example, in the tech industry, usually what they do is they take your top line revenue number and apply a multiple to it, probably something stupid like 30 times or 50 times or whatever, because the nature of the tech industry is they know it's a long time for you to build out your own Facebook, and eventually this is going to be repaid in spades. So they provide you that value ahead of time. There's comparing there's like relative ratios, so you can take ratios like debt to equity or enterprise value or whatever, and you can compare it to other companies similar in the industry. My favorite way to do that value is to do something called the discounted cash flow, right? So without getting too technical, it basically figures out how much cash you're putting in your pocket. Okay. Now this, oftentimes a business owner will say, okay, I've got my revenue minus my expenses, and this is how much cash is going into my pocket. But that's incorrect, because that just tells you your success of the operation itself. You have a company, a corporation, and there could be multiple operations within it. There could be a fitness concept, a food concept, etc. Now, I don't advise that. I think they should be different, right? But when you take a loan to start your business, that loan is given to the company, not the business. So although you might have revenue and subtract expenses and have what's called an EBITDA margin, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. I used to call it EBITDA, but anyways.
I love that. That's funny.
That's how I would read it. And everyone on Wall Street would be like, oh my gosh. Anyways. But now you have to take that money and you have to pay your debts that you took on, any loans, you have to pay, taxes, you have to, whether you pay yourself a dividend or anything along those lines, and you could ultimately bleed out your cash to zero or negative, right? And so you've got to think about that specific sort of cash flow. And so oftentimes a franchisor will say, okay, I've got that. I've got my revenue, my expenses, I pay off my debt, all that sort of stuff. I got like $100,000 a year that I'm pocketing, or $1 million or whatever it is, right? Yeah. And then they'll go to a buyer and they'll say, well, like you're going to be making $100,000 a year into perpetuity, right? And that's my shareholder value, right? Well, how do you figure that out? And the appropriate way to do this is to think about realistically how long your business will last. Is your franchise agreement 5 years or is it 10 years? Is there some sort of cap on to how long the industry will last? And then let's say it's 5 years. You'd be like, okay, so my shareholder value is 100,000 times 5 years. Well, not really, because those other 100,000s have a value in those current years. But what's the value today? So you have to apply a discount rate, otherwise known as a cap rate, without getting, again, too technical. And it builds into this valuation implicit risk. Like, what is the risk that your business will fail, that the industry will tank? And it discounts that. So the future value of your 100,000 is actually worth less today. And then there's also a terminal value, but I won't even get into that. So as a franchisee, you can't only be thinking about how much bottom line or cash flow you're taking home today. You also have to think about what's going to be in the future, because that all factors into your shareholder value. And sometimes, go ahead. Question?
I have a question. I raised my hand.
Okay.
I have a question. I think this is super valuable for people to hear. And so much of this is speaking directly to, again, as a franchisee. So if I've invested into a franchise and I want to grow my business and I want to have a plan for, you don't want to just own the business literally until you drop dead. And even if that happens, the business has to go somewhere. Like, there always has to be, as you said, it's just natural. There has to be a succession plan. So knowing this number is going to help me in that way. So decide, how I want to exit. Here's what I want to do. Here's who I could sell it to. Here's what that could look like for my life or for my goals, right? So it factors into so much about me as a business owner. And I think maybe a franchisee doesn't even always clue in that, like, the franchisor probably is thinking about that, but me, I'm my own business owner as well. And I need to be thinking about that for what I am planning in terms of my life and my business. So I love all the math and stuff you were just mentioning. Like, I stayed with you, actually. I did.
Awesome. Cool.
But I'm curious, valuation. So this is something I actually wanted to mention. So anyone who's thinking of like a company valuation, this is the exact same thing as assessing your shareholder value. So that's just a quick note that those two things are actually the same thing. So when someone's looking to sell their franchise and they're looking for a valuation, they're trying to assess what that shareholder value is, right? Like for that specific business. So those two things are the same. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I mean, for the purposes of like this conversation, yeah, I mean, if you were to open up, chartered financial analyst textbooks and all that sort of stuff, you'll see that there is some slight differences but for the purpose of this, yeah.
But for the way we're thinking about it in terms of like how it matters to your owners and stuff, those kinds of things are very much like thought of as in the same breath, right?
Yes, yes. And actually, you made me think of something here is because I've been talking all about numbers here, and finding your shareholder value through discounted cash flow analysis and all that sort of stuff. But oftentimes a business owner will say, there's other value to me as a shareholder of this business that isn't numbers.
Mm.
So an example of this could be like, hey, my business is in this city where there are no competitors, and
Mm,
that's valuable, right?
totally.
So the question is, how do you build that value into a sale price, which is very, very difficult. And I think a lot of sellers, whether it's franchisees or franchisors trying to exit their company, they almost get a little delusional on how valuable this is, right? So if I said, hey, Belle, I'm trying to sell you my Control V arcade in Toledo, for example, okay? And I tell you there's no competitors there, so this is worth $10 million. And then you go, okay, well, if it's worth $10 million, why haven't you taken advantage of the fact that there isn't any competitors there? So naturally, I would have some sort of excuse. And then my response in most cases would be like, but you can take advantage of it. Now, a prudent investor will be like, okay, if I'm taking advantage of this massive client base that has no competitors, I'm doing that. It's my labor, my work, my investment that's going to extract revenue from them. And so there's no reason why I should be paying you for the work that I'm going to do, right? So similar to that, let's say you are exploiting all of those customers, exploiting, quote unquote, right? And they are coming in and paying, right? And they're purchasing your service. Then the seller will be like, look, I have the entire market cornered. All the customers are coming in. Well, then you got to say, okay, but look at how much expenses you have to put out in order to service those customers. You have to jack up your labor beyond a like reasonable level to the point where your bottom line means nothing. So although you may have this intangible thing, if the economics of your business don't leverage it to a good standpoint, then you've eroded or depleted away your shareholder value. And so that's, I mean, this is a subject for a whole other podcast, but this sort of digresses into the concept of building durable economic moats for your business.
Mm. So I'm definitely hearing like from our conversation so far, and I do actually want to spend the next little while here talking about the improving of that value. So how can franchisees improve that value? And then how as franchisors, of course, we want our franchisees to be improving that value of their own businesses. So I want to get into some tangible action steps for that. But I had one other question. Oh, I know what it was. We've been talking a lot about like there's lots of different ways you can assess this value, like lots of different ways you can do it. Some ways, don't factor in all the things we've been talking about. So you want to be looking at it this way. But when someone is looking at how to do this, are there tools that they can go to? Are there people that like I know that we have definitely like worked with a couple suppliers who have helped with valuations and those kinds of things. But is that the best way to do it really is to go to someone who specializes in figuring out shareholder value? Is it something you can do if you learn how to do it? Like that all sounds like a lot well over my head. But are there tools that people can leverage for how to do that? And then we'll get into the action steps for the improving.
Yeah, I mean there are software systems out there, and I've seen them. There's one actually based out of Canada that does that, but they do it to a limited standpoint because it's got to be ubiquitous against all systems, right? So put in these particular numbers, and we'll give you a good round number.
Yeah.
If you want to get into something in depth, usually you're looking for somebody called a CBV, which is a certified business valuator, and they will do this process. Now, if you're lucky enough to know somebody who has the CFA designation, the Chartered Financial Analyst designation, which is probably one of the most respected designations out there, even above an MBA in the financial world, they could probably whip it up in in an hour because they've got all the spreadsheets and stuff like that made, right? If you Google it, there's really quick and dirty ways, pull in these 5 numbers from your financial statements, add, subtract, divide, and you're ready to go, right? It really depends on how deep you want to get into it.
Got it. So there are lots of options. There are ways to get just an idea. There are ways to get a little bit deeper by leveraging more softwares. And then there are professionals who can actually help you with every single piece and work through it all
Right.
on a larger scale. Okay, I just wanted to clarify, like, what are some ways people can actually do that, just in case people are like, oh, this would be really interesting. So we've covered a lot so far in this episode, and I want to again make sure it's very tangible for people. For anyone listening who's going, okay, learning all of this is great, or maybe you knew some of these pieces already, but how do we actually improve this, right? What are the things that, I think someone might go, okay, well, easy, we just increase our revenue. Well, depending on how easy that is. But I'm curious from your perspective, because you love this topic and talk about it a lot. What are things that people can do, either franchisor or franchisee, to improve that shareholder value of the business?
Sure. Well, I mean, without getting into details of intangible things like intellectual property, I mean, maybe we could talk about that, but we'll talk about that later. The first thing I always recommend is do your best to clean up your balance sheet. What that means is get rid of the debt. Pay off your debt, pay off all the loans that you've taken, whether it's to start up the business or, COVID support loans or whatever, get that paid off, because you might have a very successful business. And then when they look at the balance sheet, they'll be like, oh, but you owe so much debt that
Yeah.
it's going to take me years to pay this off. So that's one thing that you should do. The second thing is from more of a P&L, profit and loss statement standpoint, sometimes called statement of earnings, or I forget the last name. So this is basically your revenue and your expenses. Now, your franchisor should have a guidance on this, and they should have a well-designed business model to help you do this. But these are two things, right? One is your revenue, one is your expenses. Make sure your expenses are tight, you're not overspending, or if you are overspending because you have the liberty to do so because you're making so much money, marking this stuff down to know that this is just in my scenario. So if I were to compare it, I can normalize these statements and pull that out so a buyer would know, they're just spending a lot of money on pizza because they got that money, but I may choose to spend it on a new car, right? So it's monitoring the expenses, keeping them tight, keeping them minimum without affecting the business model and the customer service and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the next component to that is driving revenue. Now, you've had a number of podcasts. Everyone's always talking about driving revenue, et cetera. But, you can drive revenue from the standard standpoint that your franchisor gives you. This is the widget you're selling. This is the price at which you're selling it. But there's opportunities there to have other creative ways. So in the subject of intangibles, right? If you are an organization that typically works with schools, right? And you're going out and you're pitching each individual school, maybe there's an opportunity to go to, the head of all these schools and strike up an agreement with them, and potentially maybe even an exclusive agreement that they have to deal with you. And then you've got now not only another source of revenue, but you've added this intangible value to the value of your company. You can do that. You could lean on your franchisor to see if there's ways not only that they can reduce costs, but that they can reduce costs at a rate that somebody else may not. An example I love to give is the shipping companies, whether it's FedEx or UPS or Purolite or whatever. They already have planes and trucks and buses going to like every corner of the planet, Amazon as well. So for them to ship an additional package, there's a very minimal additional marginal expense. That fuel and everything is already being paid for. So this becomes almost entirely profit-based. So maybe there's a way that the franchisor can adjust your expenses that way. You can build a network effect. That's another big economic moat where you've got buyers and sellers in one marketplace that your business takes advantage of.
Interesting. So lots of different ways, but one thing that's definitely standing out in all those examples is how powerful it is to know those numbers and to be like analyzing those P&Ls, analyzing your profit and loss P&L, same thing, but analyzing those financial documents, looking for areas of opportunity. So areas of either, again, trying to make something where, wow, we're going about these sales kind of one at a time. Is there a way for us to go like more directly to the source? For example, I love that school example. And then looking at exclusive deals, looking at how to partner with people strategically. So you're kind of leveraging more with less. But then also the analyzing your expenses and seeing, are there things we can trim off, or are there things we can package together? Again, never compromising on consumer experience and quality and all those things, but are there things we can analyze and go, oh, this other franchisee, you know, maybe in somewhere else has a very, very different expense for this. And like, is there any way we could leverage that as well? Sometimes not, but sometimes there is. So looking at things like benchmarks or getting system-wide data, like I'm hearing a lot of that being a common one in terms of how to make the most out of increasing the value of your company. Like that seems to be a very common theme.
Yeah, and you know what? Distilling it down into something that's micro is way more manageable than looking at the macro. You know, if you look at your books and you say, "Wow, I need to make an extra $100,000 this month." Okay, well, let's break that down into how much you need to make per month. Break it down to per day, break it down to per customer, and you may only need one more customer a day in order to hit that thing. So now you have a bit of a goal for you know, the sale or the upsale or whatever it may be. And the same thing goes with your expenses. You know, you can trim them down a little bit here or there to increase that financial value, I should say. When you add intangibles, there's like, you know, a whole other way of valuing those.
Yeah, and I feel like that almost needs to be a whole other conversation too, that intangibles piece, because I think we've been getting into a lot of good in-depth information here, and I want to make sure people don't feel too overwhelmed. But I really like these. I think the big one being the paying off the debt, which I think is, again, it's pretty much a financial tip overall, right? How do we improve the value? We get rid of what we owe. I think that's such a good one. And then the examining your P&Ls and being really, really clear on them. I think that's something franchisees can do to major moves. Like it would make a major impact to like be really, really good at looking at your P&L and examining it and looking for areas of improvement.
Yeah, if I may, I just want to throw one word of caution in here that I see a lot with franchisees. Is if their business isn't looking great, sometimes they go down the spiral of trying to save $50 here or there, when the actual problem is they need to make $10,000 more. Those small cost savings not only are going to be a drop in the bucket, but they're also digressing their mindset. They're thinking in a world of, you know, scarcity. They're thinking about, you know, maybe even affecting the brand, when the big problem is the revenue.
That is so key. And that's something we do a lot in terms of even like AC performance groups and field coach infrastructure and doing those types of franchisee support pieces. That's something we see a lot with franchise owners, especially when we go through like really hard times for small businesses in local communities. And even with the support of franchisors, the support of home offices, it can be really, really tough when you go through something really tricky with the economy. And so to keep that mindset really positive and moving forward and thinking on that making more rather than saving a little is so key. It is tough sometimes, and that's why having someone like a field coach or franchisee support roles who are there to help with that mindset is so big. But I totally agree. I think that's really something, if we can get your franchise owners of whatever business or system you're in to be thinking that way, it opens up so much more opportunity. And that actually increases the value, right? Saving $150 every month isn't going to be majorly increasing value that way. And it may even be like hurting your capacity to be making more, right? To be trying to cut costs on things.
I was talking to somebody and they increased the price to their end consumer by $1, which ended up being somewhere around a 2.5% increase, which is less than the increase in inflation. And that $1 increase enabled them to pay their rent for 2 months.
Wow.
You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah, it's looking at it in the expansive and the abundant, as opposed to that scarcity or that like, how much can we save or how much can we keep? Like I love that mindset piece. And I think that's very tangible and something that having someone supporting your Z's with that type of mindset and with that type of goal setting is going to really, really help. Robert, this has been so fantastic. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything we've missed in this conversation? I know that we're probably going to have lots more chats about some of the nitty gritty, and I know some of the intangible pieces that you were mentioning. I think we could definitely have more conversations on that. But is there anything else you want to add before we finish up for today?
Yeah, I think just one word of advice is don't sleep on your financials.
Mm,
People think it's just something I need to do because my franchisor requires it and because the government requires it to fill out my taxes. But if you're sleeping on them, you don't like watch Shark Tank or Dragon's Den. If you don't know your financials, you're out. They're not even getting into it, you know? Like you need to know this stuff so that you know the health of your business and that so you as the leader of your business can direct it in the right way, because the same way the CEO of a franchise system is responsible for those three things that I mentioned earlier, that same way a franchisee is responsible for those three things within their system, building the culture, thinking about the next innovative move forward, and increasing shareholder value.
I love that, Robert. This has been such a great episode. I really think there's so many tangible steps in here, and also a lot of education for anyone. Again, if you want to send this to your franchisees, I think that could be really valuable. But also as franchisors, to be just really understanding, like, we want every single one of our owners to be thriving and to know their numbers and to feel good about where they're headed and to have a plan for succession. Like, that is just such a big part of business, and it applies especially to the franchise model. So I just want to thank you so much for the call today. I know I took away a lot. I was taking some notes at the end there. And I'm really, really excited. Hopefully we can do another episode on more financial topics, maybe some moats. I know you love that.
I love moats.
So thank you so much again. And for anyone listening who has not joined the AC Roundtable community quite yet, this is your sign. You get to come hang out with Robert and I weekly on the AC Roundtables. We have established franchisors and emerging franchisors, two different roundtables that run weekly. We are coming, I think we just passed our 3-year anniversary when this comes out, which is so exciting. And if you haven't checked us out yet, please do head to angelacote.com/roundtables to come join the fun. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and go be awesome.